When the billionaire rushed through his mansion's front door that night, his heart stopped at the sight before him. His 2 children huddled on the lawn, their faces streaked with ash and tears, and their golden retriever standing just a few feet away, fur singed, blood on its paws, looking like the monster responsible for the chaos around them. And in that moment of terror and rage, this powerful man who controlled empires made the worst decision of his life. A decision that would haunt him forever. But before I tell you what he did, you need to understand exactly how this family got here, and why everything you think you know about this story is completely wrong. You see, Marcus Whitfield wasn't just wealthy, he was the kind of wealthy that most people can't even imagine. The kind where private jets feel ordinary and vacation homes span continents. And at 47 years old, he had built a tech empire from nothing, clawing his way from a tiny apartment in Ohio to a sprawling estate in California worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. But here's the thing about men like Marcus. The same relentless drive that builds empires often crumbles families, and though he loved his children more than anything in this world, his way of showing it was through giving them everything money could buy, rather than the one thing money could never purchase, which was simply his time. His daughter Emma was 8 years old with curious brown eyes and a laugh that could fill any room. And his son Lucas was just 5, quiet and thoughtful, the kind of boy who noticed things others missed and felt emotions deeper than he could ever express. Their mother had passed away 3 years earlier from an illness that took her slowly and painfully, and Marcus had buried his grief in work, convincing himself that success was the best way to honor her memory, when really, he was just running from the emptiness she left behind. So who filled that void for these 2 children when their father was in meetings, or traveling overseas or locked in his home office for hours? The answer had 4 legs, golden fur, and a heart bigger than any human Marcus had ever employed. His name was Captain, a 5-year-old golden retriever that Marcus's wife had brought home as a puppy just months before she got sick. And from the very first day, that dog had attached himself to those children like they were his entire reason for existing. Emma would come home from school, and Captain would be waiting at the door, tail wagging so hard his whole body shook, and Lucas, who struggled to make friends and often felt invisible, would spend hours curled up with Captain, whispering secrets into that soft fur. Secrets he trusted no human to keep. Captain slept between their beds every single night, positioning himself exactly in the middle so he could watch over both of them. And when thunderstorms rolled through and Lucas would cry, Captain would press his warm body against the boy until the fear melted away. The household staff adored Captain. The gardeners gave him treats, and even Marcus, despite his emotional distance, would sometimes pause in the hallway and watch the dog playing with his children with something that looked almost like envy, wishing he could connect with Emma and Lucas as effortlessly as this animal did. But here's where the trouble began, because on a Thursday evening in late October, Marcus received a call that demanded his immediate attention. A crisis at his company's headquarters that threatened a merger worth billions, and he had no choice but to leave. He found Emma and Lucas in the living room. Captain sprawled across their laps as they watched a movie, and he knelt down, promised he'd be back before midnight, kissed their foreheads, and told Maria, their live-in housekeeper, to make sure they were in bed by 9. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that Maria had been fighting a terrible migraine all day, the kind that blurred her vision and made standing painful, and after putting the children to bed at 8:30, she took her medication and fell into a deep sleep in her quarters on the far side of the mansion. A sleep so heavy that what came next would unfold without her ever knowing until it was almost too late. It was around 10:15 when the fire started, and investigators would later determine it began in the basement where old electrical wiring had finally given up after decades of strain, sparking against insulation that caught like dry paper. The smoke rose silently at first, creeping through the vents and walls like a thief, and by the time it reached the second floor where Emma and Lucas slept in their separate rooms, it had grown thick enough to kill. Captain was the first to sense it, his nose twitching, his body suddenly rigid on the floor between the children's beds, and within seconds he was on his feet, pacing, whining, scratching at Lucas's door with an urgency that made no sense to the sleeping boy. Lucas stirred, annoyed, mumbling for Captain to stop, but the dog wouldn't stop, couldn't stop, because every instinct in his body was screaming danger in a language humans couldn't hear. Captain barked once, then twice, then erupted into a continuous alarm that finally jolted Lucas fully awake. And when the boy sat up and rubbed his eyes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Gray smoke curling under his bedroom door like ghostly fingers reaching for him. Lucas screamed, and that scream woke Emma in the next room. And suddenly both children were crying, coughing, calling for Maria, calling for their father, calling for anyone to save them, but no one came. The smoke was getting thicker, the air harder to breathe, and Lucas froze in terror, his small body unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but sob. This is when Captain did something that would change everything. He grabbed Lucas's pajama sleeve in his teeth and pulled, hard, yanking the boy off the bed and toward the door. And when Lucas resisted, too scared to move toward the smoke, Captain bit down on his wrist just hard enough to leave marks, just hard enough to force the boy to follow. Lucas cried out in pain and confusion, not understanding why his best friend was hurting him. But Captain didn't stop, couldn't stop, because stopping meant death. The dog dragged Lucas into the hallway where the smoke was even thicker, then pushed open Emma's door with his body, and found her huddled in the corner, coughing violently, tears streaming down her face. Captain barked at her, circled her, nudged her toward the door, and when she wouldn't move, he did the same thing he'd done to Lucas. Grabbed her nightgown and pulled with all his strength, ripping the fabric, scratching her skin with his claws in his desperation. Emma screamed that Captain was hurting her, that something was wrong with him. But the dog ignored her cries and kept pulling, kept pushing, herding these children through the smoke-filled hallway toward the staircase like they were sheep, and he was the only shepherd who could save them. The heat was rising now, the fire spreading faster, and Captain's paws burned against the heated floor, his lungs filling with smoke that made every breath agony, but he didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't even hesitate. When they reached the stairs, Lucas stumbled and fell, tumbling down several steps before landing in a heap at the bottom. And Captain was there instantly, licking his face, pulling him up, forcing him to keep moving even as the boy clutched his bruised arm and sobbed. Emma was right behind them, but a piece of burning debris fell from the ceiling and blocked her path. And without thinking, Captain turned and ran back up those stairs, back into the thickening smoke, back toward the flames, because leaving her behind was simply not an option his loyal heart could accept. He found Emma frozen at the top of the stairs, the fire now visible behind her, orange and angry and growing. And he did the only thing he could. He positioned his body beside hers and pushed, shoving her sideways toward a different route, a servant's staircase at the end of the hall that was still clear. His fur was smoking now, the tips of his ears singed, and every breath was a struggle. But he pushed and guided and herded until finally, they burst through a side door and stumbled onto the lawn, where Lucas was already waiting, crying, calling for his sister. The neighbors had seen the flames by now and called 911. And Maria had finally woken to the sound of sirens, emerging from her quarters in confusion and horror as she realized the main house was engulfed in fire, and the children were outside, alone, shaking, covered in ash and marks that looked disturbingly like animal attacks. And this is exactly the scene Marcus arrived to 30 minutes later, having broken every speed limit after receiving the emergency call. His children wrapped in blankets, his mansion half consumed by flames, and his dog sitting apart from everyone, injured and panting, looking for all the world like a dangerous animal who had just attacked his kids. Emma's nightgown was torn, her arms scratched and bleeding, and she was too traumatized to speak clearly, only managing to say that Captain wouldn't stop biting and pulling and hurting them. Lucas showed the marks on his wrist, the bruise on his arm from falling, and in his shell-shocked state, he couldn't explain that Captain had been saving him. He could only remember the fear and the pain and the confusion of being dragged through smoke by teeth that broke his skin. Maria, consumed with guilt for sleeping through the crisis, reported that she'd always thought Captain was too rough with the children, too possessive, too unpredictable, and one of the neighbors mentioned seeing the dog acting crazy through the window before the fire trucks arrived. Every piece of evidence, every terrified whisper, every visible injury pointed to one conclusion in Marcus's panicked mind. His dog had attacked his children during the chaos of the fire, had made everything worse, had hurt the only two people in this world he truly loved. And Marcus, this powerful billionaire who was used to making swift decisions, who had built an empire by trusting his gut, made the most devastating decision of his life when he turned to one of his security guards and said, "Get that dog off my property and don't bring him back." Captain seemed to understand, his brown eyes finding Marcus's face, searching for the love that had always been there, finding only rage and fear instead. And when the security guard grabbed his collar and began pulling him toward a vehicle, Captain didn't resist, didn't fight, just looked back once at Emma and Lucas with an expression that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Confused, heartbroken, and somehow accepting, as if he knew that loving these children had been worth whatever came. Next, they took him to a shelter that night, injured, burned, abandoned, and the billionaire went to the hospital with his children, convinced he had just protected his family from a threat. But here's the thing about truth. It doesn't stay buried, no matter how much fear and chaos try to hide it. 3 days later, Marcus was sitting in a hotel suite, his children recovering in the next room, when his security team approached him with something they'd recovered from the mansion's damaged security system. Footage that had survived the fire on a cloud backup, footage that told a very different story. Marcus watched in growing horror as the video showed Captain pacing, alerting, barking, trying desperately to wake Lucas while smoke filled the room. He watched his dog grab his son's sleeve and pull him to safety. Watched him bite only when Lucas wouldn't move. Watched him run back into the flames to save Emma, when any other creature would have fled. He watched Captain shield his daughter's body with his own when the burning debris fell, taking burns on his back that were meant for her. He watched his loyal, loving, heroic dog save both of his children's lives through sheer determination and sacrifice. And then he watched himself order that same dog taken away like garbage. The tablet slipped from Marcus's shaking hands as the full weight of what he had done crushed him. And for the first time since his wife's funeral, this man who controlled billions, who commanded thousands of employees, who had never let anyone see him weak, completely broke down. He sobbed like a child, great heaving cries that brought his actual children running into the room. And when Emma asked what was wrong, Marcus couldn't speak, could only point at the frozen image on the screen showing Captain's burned and bloody body still pushing her toward safety. Emma watched the footage, and then Lucas watched, and suddenly, the confused memories started making sense. Captain hadn't been hurting them. He'd been saving them, and every bite, every scratch, every rough pull had been an act of desperate love from a creature who couldn't speak, but would rather die than let them come to harm. Marcus was in his car within minutes, calling the shelter, demanding information, but what he heard made his heart stop all over again. Captain had been so badly injured that they weren't sure he would survive, and he'd stopped eating since arriving, as if he'd simply given up on living. Marcus drove faster than he'd ever driven, burst through the shelter doors like a man possessed, and demanded to see his dog immediately. They led him to a small room in the back where Captain lay on a blanket, bandages covering his burns, his breathing shallow, his eyes closed. The vet explained that the dog had severe smoke inhalation, second-degree burns on his back and paws, and hadn't touched food or water since arriving, as if the will to live had been taken from him. Marcus fell to his knees beside that blanket, tears streaming down his face, and whispered, "I'm sorry, Captain, I'm so sorry, I didn't understand. I was scared and I was wrong and I need you to forgive me. I need you to come home. The kids need you. I need you. Please don't give up." And maybe dogs can't understand human words. Or maybe they understand something deeper than words, because Captain's eyes slowly opened, and his tail gave one weak thump against the blanket, and his tongue reached out to lick the tears from the billionaire's face. Marcus stayed at that shelter for 6 hours, lying on the floor beside his dog, hand resting on Captain's bandaged side, promising over and over that he would never doubt him again, that he would spend the rest of his life making this right. When he finally brought Captain home 3 weeks later, fully recovered except for scars he would carry forever, Emma and Lucas were waiting on the front steps of their temporary home. And the reunion was everything. The children crying and laughing and burying their faces in golden fur. Captain's tail wagging so hard he nearly knocked Lucas over. And Marcus standing back, watching, finally understanding that the most valuable thing in his life had never been money or power or success, but the love that existed in moments exactly like this one. He later learned that Captain's breed is often used in search and rescue because of their intelligence and loyalty, but no training could explain what that dog did that night. That was something deeper, something that came from years of sleeping between two beds, of being trusted with whispered secrets, of loving two small humans so completely that fire and smoke and burning flesh couldn't stop him from bringing them to safety. Marcus donated millions to animal rescue organizations, built a new wing at the shelter that had saved Captain's life, and most importantly, he finally stopped working 16-hour days and started being present for the children and the dog who had taught him what really mattered. Captain lived another 7 years, his back forever marked with scars that Emma and Lucas would gently trace with their fingers while telling the story of the night their dog became their hero. And when he finally passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the family he had saved, Marcus built a statue of him in the garden of their new home. A permanent reminder that love doesn't need words, that loyalty doesn't ask for credit, and that sometimes the most heroic hearts beat inside the ones we almost threw away. So I have to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. Have you ever misjudged someone or something because you were too scared or too angry to see the truth? Have you ever pushed away exactly the love you needed most? If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of a dog who saved you in ways you never thanked them for, or if it made you hold your pet a little tighter tonight, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, someone who loves dogs, someone who might be doubting the loyalty that's standing right beside them, maybe share this video with them, because sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never ask to be seen.